And joining me now from Halifax is the outgoing executive director of the Atlantic Jewish Council, Naomi Rosenfeld. Welcome to the CJN Daily.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. Actually, you've been on before because you testified or spoke at a community anti-Semitism rally earlier in the year from Halifax. So I remember putting you on. But, congratulations on the upcoming reason why you've decided to step away. Maybe you want to tell our audience a little bit about this email that went out and, what your message was.
Absolutely. So last week, we announced officially to the community through a letter from the president of the Atlantic Jewish Council, Eric Drucker, that I have officially given my notice to the organization and to the community that I will be leaving my position. I am expecting a baby in about a month, which is very exciting, my first. And my husband and I have decided, and it was quite heartbreaking to do so, but have decided to move back to Toronto, which is where he and I are both from and where our families still reside to raise our child. So unfortunately, that means that I have to step away from this position and this community that I really, really love so much.
We're going to get into that decision, as you call it, heartbreaking, a little bit later. We'll come back to it, but let's take a step back and tell us how you decided to move to Halifax and become, the face and voice of Atlantic Jewry several years ago. How did that come about?
Yeah, definitely not something I think I would have predicted when I was younger and when I was thinking about what my career and what my future would be like. I spent my summers growing up as a kid going to Camp Kadima, as many of the listeners of this podcast will know. Camp Kadima has been around since 1943. It's a camp owned and operated by the Atlantic Jewish Council, which is just about an hour south of where I am now, in Barse Corner, Nova Scotia. And my mom had actually spent a couple summers at Camp Kadima, so I had a little bit of family history there, but also just its reputation as a camp was so stellar that me and my brothers ended up there when we were kids. And so I actually spent about 10 summers there, both as a camper and on staff. So I always had this connection to the Atlantic Jewish community, this connection to the Maritimes. And then eventually I made my way here after university and I took on the role as our Hillel director out here. And that was kind of by fluke. I wasn't really interested. I had been very involved in Hillel at Queen's University, which is where I did my undergrad. But I wasn't really looking to be in the Hillel world. But a friend of mine was, and she was looking at all the open positions in the Hillel world in Canada. And when she talked about the position opening up in Atlantic Canada, I sort of said to her, I said, no, you can't take that. I said, that's my position. I wasn't really thinking I was going to apply for it, but I said, no, you can't end up in Halifax working for the Atlantic. That's my community. And so anyways, word got through the grapevine. And because I still had all these connections to the Jewish community, they reached out and I ended up applying and taking that job. And so it was wonderful. I was out here for a little bit working as the Hillel director. And then eventually I decided to go back to school, to go to graduate school. And I ended up at Brandeis University at a program called the Hornstein Jewish Professional Leadership Program. So I was studying both business and Jewish nonprofit management. And I was there on a scholarship from a place called Jewish Federations of North America. And the scholarship, the idea was that they would fund my education and that I would work for a Jewish federation when I was done. And so again, I never thought I'd come back to Halifax because, John Goldberg was here. I had worked for him. He had been here forever. But as I was finishing school, I heard through the rumor mill that John was going to be retiring. And so I reached out and I ended up, I was still in touch with many of the community members. And here we are 7 years later. I'm still here.
Now, when you first came as executive director of the Atlantic Jewish Council, it was 2016, I guess. 2015, the world was a different place. What were the main challenges you faced then?
When I came here in the summer of 2016, when I was taking this job, the issues that were presented to me were fairly common issues that a lot of smaller Jewish communities were having, right? We were seeing a loss in numbers, especially a lot of the younger people who were raised here were not ending up here and not having families here. So there was a big struggle in terms of demographics overall. And also there was a large unaffiliated community, right? Who, the traditional methods of affiliating with the Jewish community. So synagogue memberships, sending your kids to camp, sending your kids to supplemental Hebrew school. The community was having a harder and harder time convincing convincing a lot of these unaffiliated families to join. So I would say that those were sort of the main issues, which again, not uncommon for small Jewish communities. There's always struggles. We're geographically really far away from a lot of the major urban centers and the major Jewish centers. So how can we find out what those best practices are and bring those best practices here when resources are limited? So I would say those were sort of some of the typical challenges that I began with.
How has COVID, impacted what you've been able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that COVID has been difficult, right? So many people have been devastated, not only by COVID as a health concern, but also the financial concerns, all of the concerns that surround COVID. And as well as a community where a lot of people have connections that are far away. And as many of you know, Nova Scotia sort of created very strict restrictions in terms of who could leave and who could come. So it was very isolating to be here. So that was some of the hard pieces of COVID. What I actually think is the silver linings from a Jewish communal perspective is that COVID really forced us to evolve and to rethink the way that we are offering some of our programs. It also forced all of us listening, to get a little more comfortable with technology than maybe we were before COVID. And so now what we've done with some of our marquee programs, really all of our programs, has been able to offer them virtually and to be able to reach, especially here in Atlantic Canada, where we have pockets that are separated by pretty far, geographies, right? From Newfoundland to New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia. We're not physically, geographically so close. And so being able to connect, using technology to connect and weave programs together, maybe now that COVID, now that we're coming out of some of those major restrictions in a hybrid form, but I don't think we'll ever go back. So we're off, our film festival, last year we offered it completely virtually. This year we're offering it as a hybrid session. And I don't know that we'll ever go back to offering only in person, because we get to engage so many more people across our large geography when it's done virtually. And that's true for many, many programs that we do, that we're able to reach more. And as well, we're able to have partnerships with other organizations and other communities, right? I think it's so beautiful that we, for Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut, we've had these cross-Canada and Rosh Hashanah, we've had these cross-Canada programs that really have united us across the country. And again, I hope to see an end to this pandemic soon, but I hope that some of those lessons and some of those learnings do continue, because I think they've been excellent.
When you first got there, traditionally, what was the Halifax community? Mostly Ashkenazi, mostly locals, a few professors here and there from away at various universities. I'm asking, I don't actually know. And how does it look today? And talk about percentage, if you could.
Yeah, I don't have great numbers, but I'll tell you. So when I came, we were at the tail end of a project that the Atlantic Jewish Council had taken on around 2009, 2010. So the Atlantic Jewish Council and the Atlantic Jewish community had seen our demographics as a community, had looked at it and analyzed it, and realized that, again, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the Jewish community members who had grown up here had left, maybe for university or maybe, for other reasons, for employment reasons, and had not come back. So if you looked at our demographics as a community, they were very, very senior, and there was not a lot of young families to be able to repopulate our community. This is true. If you were to look at the makeup, there was a lot of people who had grown up with their roots here in the Maritimes. It's a very strongly rooted historic community. A lot of people can trace their families back for generations and generations to the various interweaving communities in Atlantic Canada. And Kadima often is to thank for that, because it brought so many of these Jewish people together, and then the families intertwined. And some, professionals who had moved out here for the various university towns and whatnot. But in the early 2000s, the Atlantic Jewish Council began an immigration program, where actually the Atlantic Jewish Council was sponsoring families from Israel to move to Atlantic Canada. So this was all before my time. And it was, as I mentioned, my predecessor, John Goldberg, and many, many volunteers. So they worked together, and I believe they brought about 100 Israeli families. This was through a partnership with the Nova Scotia government, where there was something called a community stream, where we could fast track immigrant families if we as a Jewish community were able to provide certain services for them. So actually, by the time I got here, here, that stream had ended. It was a pilot stream program and the government had ended the program. So officially, by the time I got here, we were no longer providing that immigration program at all. We still had some families trickling in because they were, they had visas and there had been delays. So we still had some families trickling in. The interesting thing that I've seen in the last 5 years is that we've had a huge number of people, of families immigrating from Israel, not through an organized program of the Jewish community. People are just coming. They're coming on student visas, they're coming on worker visas. So we've actually seen our Israeli population continue to grow since I've been here. I mean, over the summer, anecdotally, I know of 10 to 20 families who've immigrated to Halifax. And so that's been really interesting. And I think we'll continue to see immigration play a role in the changing demographics and the growth of our community.
These are Russian Israelis as opposed to what, or are they mixed?
Not exclusively. Yes, we have quite a few families who had immigrated from the former Soviet Union to Israel and then immigrated from Israel here to Atlantic Canada. But we also have families who were not from the former Soviet Union, who were from Israel and came here. So it's really a mix.
And, I know that, for example, when you're looking at the makeup of the Atlantic Jewish Council board and you look at the last names, it's not all, Epstein and there's a lot of Conters, but and Goldberg, that you said that these legacy names, there's a lot of names of people who are newcomers as well. So not only are they coming, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, they're also getting involved and working for the Federation as a volunteer or even staff, right?
Absolutely. I like to joke in the office, I'm the only person in my office who doesn't speak fluent Hebrew. I try, I have a day school education, I try hard, but everyone else spent a significant amount of time living in Israel. So yeah, absolutely. Again, I think the way that people are affiliating with our Jewish community in Atlantic Canada looks different than maybe it once did. There was a time in many years ago where, affiliation looked very specifically, like every single family sent their kids to Camp Kadima and every single family had a synagogue membership. And while it doesn't look exactly like that right now, we are seeing strong affiliation and strong identification from all demographics here. So it's been very positive.
Okay, so you also wrote that one of the big challenges is engaging youth and the unaffiliated, but youth as well. How does that look now? You started in Hillel, so I know that that's your kind of background, but how is that working, keeping young people there or bringing them to Dalhousie or what have you, or the different universities and keeping them there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's sort of a couple of different pieces to engaging youth. We've had here in Atlantic Canada, we've had a PJ Library program for a very long time, long before me. A group of volunteers decided this was very important. And I, from my time, both in Toronto and working and living in Boston in the Jewish community, I had seen what a powerful tool PJ Library could be, not just as a program itself, which of course is amazing, right? Where families get books and it's a wonderful program, but as an engagement tool, where that's the first step to reach out to young families. And then that's used as a tool. So I'm really proud. When I got here, we had about 40 odd families receiving PJ Library books across Atlantic Canada. We've now expanded the program. At that time, there was a limit of, you could only get books until you were about 5. Now we expanded it, and then PJ Library expanded. So now you can get books right up until the age of 13. And now we have almost 400 kids getting books every single month. So that alone has been such an incredible and powerful tool. And we've also been able to build a whole realm of programming and engagement around PJ Library, using that branding, which parents affiliate with so positively. And a huge, huge thank you to the Harold Grinsman Foundation, who supported us in so many numerous ways in this initiative with grants and staff support and training. And so we've been able to really, really grow our PJ Library initiative to be able to engage those young families in programming. We just began a Shalom Baby program where now every time someone has a baby in Atlantic Canada, they get like an adorable little gift basket that includes PJ Library books and a Kadima onesie and all these fun little gifts for new families to really welcome them into the community in that way. And then now, of course, we're working on what's next, what's after PJ. what does our teen programming look like? And also how do we have a strong transition from that into our Hillel program? And so that's, I cannot take credit. It's my amazing staff members who, my Hillel director and my PGA library director and all the staff who work at the AJC have really been incredible. But we've seen quite a bit of progress in terms of really creating a feeling like there's a young Jewish family community here in Atlantic Canada.
Okay, let's pivot away from that for a minute and talk about the major thing that kept you up at night starting in May, but probably even before that when COVID hit, which is anti-Semitism in Atlantic Canada. It is not immune. And you've faced lots of problems, especially with the Hamas-Israel hostilities. What was the worst thing personally that you have had to experience in terms of how Jews were treated in the Atlantic region? And how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has been tough and this has been right from the beginning. So literally my second day at work here at the Atlantic Jewish Council, we faced what was essentially a BDS vote over the Halifax Pride Parade. So this is not something new that just started in May. We've been handling this from the very beginning. Dealing with anti-Semitism in Atlantic Canada is sort of doubly tough because we're such a small proportion. The Jewish community is such a small proportion of the overall community. So there's just to nobody's fault, there's just much less awareness, right? There's much less casual education that happens between friends and neighbors because we're so small. Oftentimes most of the people in our community have never met a Jew and, have no real concept of what Jews are, what Jews look like, what Israel means to Jewish identity, and all of these different pieces, what it means to be Israeli, none of it. So we have, and then certainly since this past May, we've seen an increase that unfortunately hasn't abated, since May. And so I think the hardest thing that some of the hardest issues that I've dealt with are issues of anti-Semitism with our youth, with our teenagers, and with kids in the classroom and things like that. And it's just tough, if you're the only Jewish kid in your school and you end up with, a swastika spray painted on your school, it's a really tough, it's a tough experience for anyone, but particularly if you are having to face it in isolation because you don't have, a number of Jewish kids in your school or even a number of Jewish kids in your class. So it has been quite tough, but it's a significant priority that we're spending a lot of time on right now.
But you also had businesses that were attacked. You had stickers saying that Jews started COVID, things like that, which, doesn't really, you had Moncton Synagogue. The synagogue was vandalized. Whether that was anti-Semitism or not is still not clear, but still it came at the time. So it was a heightened tension, right? The community Absolutely. Was on edge in Moncton and elsewhere as well. So how are you making inroads? I know, for instance, during the recent the recent provincial election, you worked very hard with the Nova Scotia government on this file. Maybe you wanted to share a little bit of what you did.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say both, because we had back-to-back elections this summer. We had elections on a provincial level and then, of course, our national elections. And so we made sure to meet with candidates from all parties, leadership from all parties, and address just how significant anti-Semitism is. I'm a huge believer that when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism, first of all, we can't do it alone. And I say that we as in the Atlantic Jewish Council can't do it alone, but also we as Jews can't do it alone, that it will take a lot of allies and a lot of partnerships. So we work very closely with our partners at CJN, at the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, to work and to advocate on behalf of trying to have different measures in place to tackle anti-Semitism, and also just education. So meeting with people one-on-one from government and elected officials, but also in all sectors of society, university, the police, other nonprofit organizations, educating them, I think is going to be incredibly important. I actually just gave a presentation just a couple of weeks ago to a new class of recruits at the Halifax Regional Police. And they had a day of diversity training, and I was invited to come in and give an hour presentation on anti-Semitism. And it was just, a lot of them said to me afterwards, like, we'd never learned anything like this. Like, this was, so eye-opening. So I really do believe, I've lived here, over 7 years, if you include my time at Hillel. I think Atlantic Canada is a wonderful community, and I think people are eager and ready to learn. And it's up to us as a Jewish community to try and provide that education and to make sure we're not forgotten about.
So, you're coming home because you said in the letter was said you wanted to be closer to your own parental, relatives, bubbies, ladies, to be closer. What message does that send? How hard was that to deal with? How does that received by the people in the Maritimes?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this has always been my second home. Atlantic Canada has always been my second home. That was true when I was 9 years old and I first stepped foot at Kadima, and that's still true today. I think in a weird way, it was the work that I've done at the Atlantic Jewish Council, especially with regards to engaging young families. And I've seen what an asset it is when people live close to their parents and their kids' grandparents, and how much they're able to help one another. And I think that had a huge persuasive factor on me to making this choice that, I wanted to raise my child closer to the child's grandparents and uncles and aunts and nieces and nephews. And so it is heartbreaking, but I think people understood, because we're a very family oriented community. People are very, very close to their families. And so I think people did understand. But that's not to say, if it wasn't for that one fact, I would be raising my family here. I think this is an amazing place to live. I think it's an amazing place to raise a family. I think the quality of life is so high. I think that the Jewish community is so special. I've talked a lot in the past about seeing the Jewish identity and the Jewish leadership that comes out of smaller communities like those here in Atlantic Canada. And I think it's a very, very powerful force for good. People have to get involved. They have to roll up their sleeves. And, if they want to see something happen in the Jewish community, they have to make it happen themselves. And it's quite an amazing example. And there's a lot to be learned from smaller Jewish communities like those in Atlantic Canada, that, those of us who are from larger Jewish communities, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. So it's the right decision for me, but I certainly don't want to imply for a second that this is not an amazing place to live, an amazing place to raise a family, an amazing Jewish community. Well, as my husband and I say, we're going to come back and visit all the time. This kid's probably going to go to Camp Kadima. It's still, we still consider it home. We're moving for family.
All right. Last thing is about your favorite, your haunts. It's hard to be Jewish in a small town, especially to keep kosher, right? And I know that is something even more people in the Atlantic region struggle with. So, what can you recommend for people? Where do you eat? Where do you get your favorite stuff?
In Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's hard. There's the availability of kosher food, the availability of Jewish food is very, very tough. But you just kind of have to make it work. So I'm going to say my favorite places to eat are going to be the dozens and dozens of community members who've invited me over to their homes to celebrate holidays. We don't have a kosher restaurant in town. We don't have a kosher caterer in town. When people want to make Jewish events, they do it themselves. And that's kind of the beauty of it, right? Since I've moved here, there's now a couple places where you can get kosher challah, and there's been a little bit of improvement on some of those levels. But ultimately, if you want a Jewish meal, you have to put in the work and then invite your friends and your neighbors over. And that's what this Jewish community is all about. So I'm going to miss that a lot.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing this with us here on the CJN Daily. Good luck. And let us know, when the big day comes.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to listening every week to CJN Daily. And so can't wait to hear this one too. Thank you.
Every day, not
every day. I'm sorry. Every day.
You're not going to have mind you, you'll be up all night.
I'm a mother to be. I don't know what time.
Exactly. So when you're breastfeeding, you got 10 minutes, you'll be listening to me. All right. Love it.
All right. Thank you.
Great to see you again. Good luck.
Appreciate it. Thank you.